BioWare's once legendary status has taken a brutal hit over the last decade with Andromeda, Anthem, and the recent Dragon Age struggles with Veilguard's failures. But with a new Mass Effect on the horizon, you have to ask, is BioWare destined to fumble yet again? Or can the Dragon Age stumble be forgiven? And can they resurrect the beloved sci-fi epic? Or is it just another disaster waiting to happen? BioWare is, or more aptly put, was, my favorite video game developer. For over a decade, they made some of my favorite games ever, and it just felt like they couldn't possibly put out a bad game. From Baldur's Gate to Knights of the Old Republic, the Mass Effect trilogy, the first 3 Dragon Age games, especially Origins, they were on a roll for a long time. Then came Andromeda. You can clearly tell this game changed when it wanted to be like mid-development, and it just didn't work out. They wanted essentially, what No Man's Sky did with procedurally generated worlds, but handcrafted content in these kinds of RPGs are what fans actually want. Just look at Starfield and how big of a failure that game was. After the very mid-release of Andromeda, not a terrible game, but definitely not a game that lives up to BioWare's standards, came Anthem. Now, on paper, Anthem sounds like a great game. Essentially a Destiny-type game, but with flying Iron Man suits. I don't want to go into all the development troubles of this game, because, boy, there's a whole video unto itself, but suffice to say, this game was never going to succeed, and I'm actually shocked at how well it handled and played, considering the short development time with all the reworks. I mean, BioWare didn't even know what the game was truly going to be until after their E3 showing of the game and its release date only a year later. When they showed off all the Iron Man and the flying around, which was just something they threw together at last minute, that's what fans gravitated towards, so they had to completely, rework what they were going to do. So that's just insane to think about. Anyways, long story short, the game absolutely bombed, and BioWare's reputation was shattered. How could a company this strong put out something, so mediocre, so bad? Well, unfortunately for BioWare, the worst was yet to come. After their announcement that they were in fact working on a new Mass Effect, speculated to be Mass Effect 4, a direct sequel to the original trilogy and not a side story spin-off like Andromeda, they were also working on the next installment for the Dragon Age series. Now, again, we have a very similar story here. EA just doesn't know how to handle one of its best single-player RPG creators and keeps trying to put them out of their comfort zone by making games that they have no experience in, on a game engine that is notoriously not designed for and, very hard as well to make. EA requires its studios to use the Frostbite engine for their developers. Problem is, that engine is suited for first-person shooter type games, not complex, narrative-driven, semi-open world RPGs. In comes the developmental troubles of Veilguard, a game that originally was going to be a live service game with multiplayer elements and pretty much everything you wouldn't want from a single-player RPG game, especially from the likes of a company like BioWare. However, after the failure of Anthem, which EA and BioWare did not see coming, EA decided to scrap that plan after years of development and to start fresh. BioWare was essentially screwed from this point on, as they had to scramble together some Frankenstein's monster of the leftovers of what they originally were creating to somehow stitch together a single-player RPG from the corpse of a live service game they were building. And you can see the breadcrumbs of the live service game even in Veilguard, with the way loot is handled and how the world and the maps you're on are designed. It's clearly these maps were designed to be replayed, to go through them multiple times and to get different loot for beating stronger bosses or harder missions and things like that. It was just, that was what they envisioned. It wasn't what fans wanted. EA wanted it, but after the failures of Anthem, they all had to switch gears. on account of like the development troubles, creators leaving, the heads of the studio leaving, people being fired. And it was just a rough period of time, and like layoffs, crunch. BioWare, like there's like a whole thing about it. It was one of the worst things you could possibly hear about that a studio had to go through. And on top of all that, a bunch of new developers, where many of the old ones that made BioWare, BioWare, are long gone. So the writing in the new game is hilariously bad, laughably so, cringy, some of the cringiest dialogue you could possibly have. Like, if you were to compare that to, like, Expedition 33, it's, like, night and day of how, like, one is realistic people talking to each other, and the other are, like, weirdly written caricatures of, like, things that are happening, like, in modern day that just don't fit in, like, a fantasy setting like Dragon Age. So, all of this left Veilguard to being released and absolutely bombing in sales and critic reviews. Fast forward to today. Veilguard has been out close to a year now. BioWare's reputation is in shambles, and are still currently working on Mass Effect 4, which is their absolute last Hail Mary to ward off a studio closure from EA. Add on to the fact that most fans are quite happy with the Mass Effect trilogy, and making a fourth game that could potentially tarnish its legacy is extremely risky. Also, the fact that other studios are currently making games in a Mass Effect style that look incredible. Exodus, being developed by Archetypes Entertainment, which is established as a division of game publisher Wizards of the Coast, who do, Dungeons and Dragons. Also, we now have potentially like a Mass Effect killer with the new Owlcat games, The Expanse, Osiris Reborn, based on, the hit novel series and TV show. And it looks phenomenal. And if you know Owlcat, they make some of the best, if not the best, CRPGs in the medium, like both Pathfinder games like Kingmaker and, Path of the Righteous, and the recent, Warhammer 40k, Rogue Trader. All eyes are on BioWare going forward, as this could be the final nail in the coffin, and another studio EA will essentially axe off, adding to the meme of how many studios EA has killed over the years. Before Veilguard, my faith was there, but still a little shaky, but after that, I honestly have no hope for BioWare anymore, especially after Veilguard. It's essentially a shell of its former self, with all the talent that made it what it was long gone by now. Who knows, maybe I'm wrong, and the game will be phenomenal. But honestly, BioWare hasn't made a decent game in over a decade now, and I don't see that quote-unquote BioWare magic coming back anytime soon.